Robert Frost, in his poem Bending Walls, says there's something in a wall that everyone loves. Well, I'm sorry, Robert, not everyone loves walls, or at least not everyone loves Thomas Jefferson's wall. Basically, the mission of Chief Justice William Rehnquist, who succeeded Warren Burger as Chief Justice, and his successor and former clerk, John Roberts, is to tear down one particular wall, to tear down the wall built by Chief Justice Morrison Waite in Reynolds versus United States, but more famously by Hugo Black in the case of Emerson versus Board of Education. Rehnquist made it quite clear, even before he became Chief Justice, what he thought of the wall. In a case called Wallace versus Jaffrey, the Supreme Court was confronted with an issue from the state of Alabama. Alabama legislature had provided that before school started, there could be a moment of silence. That was not enough, apparently, for the Alabama legislature. So they went and amended the statute, saying a moment of silence or prayer. That was challenged before the Supreme Court, challenged before the Burger Court. And as I said earlier, with the Burger Court tended to fall into the secularist quadrant. And so it was declared unconstitutional, though some of the justices who were in the majority said, yeah, it's because of the addition of the word prayer. A moment of silence is okay, that's constitutional, but you've gone too far. Rehnquist wrote an opinion, dissenting from it, saying that what's wrong here is this reliance on the so-called Virginia experience, this reliance upon this metaphor of a wall of separation between church and state. Said Rehnquist, 38 years ago, this court in Everson versus Board of Education summarized its examination of the Establishment Clause doctrine thus: in the words of Jefferson, the clause against the establishment of religion by law was intended to erect a wall of separation between the church and state. That reliance on the so-called Virginia experience, Rehnquist says, is inaccurate. Yes, Madison and Jefferson took that position in Virginia. That's the position that is enunciated in the so-called memorial and remonstrance that Madison wrote. But that's not what happened in Congress when Congress proposed the First Amendment. There, it was a very different environment. Madison was a very good politician. He might not have been the most successful president, but he's the person who runs the Constitutional Convention that pulls it off. He's the one that gets the votes to ratify it. He's the one that works hard as one of the authors of the Federalist Papers. He's someone who is able to compromise, to bring together different groups. And that is what he did, Rehnquist says, in terms of the establishment of free exercise clauses. That was a compromise. It's not Virginia. It's something different. And we need not to look at Virginia for a source. We need to look elsewhere. We need basically to look to the concept of neutrality, that what the Constitution requires, what the First Amendment means, is, in the words of Hugo Black and Everson, not to prefer one religion over another, not to force one to go to church or not to go to church, but to be neutral. Of course, on this concept of neutrality, it's easy to say we're neutral, but really, what do you mean by neutrality? Or Finley Peter Dunn's character from the early part of the 20th century, Mr. Dooley. Mr. Dooley wanted to know, what about this proclamation of neutrality? What does it mean, Hennessy? What is it? For whom are we to be neutral for? Because if any of you look at neutrality, American neutrality in the First World War and the Second World War, we were basically neutral for Britain against Germany. So what do we mean by neutrality? But it is a concept, this neutrality, that goes back to Everson, in Hugo Black's opinion, and continues in a variety of opinions subsequently in terms of Board of Education versus Allen, in terms of Abington Township versus Shem, to be neutral. What this means, though, is a dramatic change in terms of the court's analysis of First Amendment cases. The Lemon Test became the standard. It comes from the Burger Court. The Lemon Test was tweaked, changed. And two of the justices who do much of the tweaking are two of the justices who play a prominent role both in the Rehnquist court and the Roberts court. Two justices that are generally referred to as swing judges or median judges, Anthony Kennedy and Sandra Day O'Connor. Their problem is with the second prong. I mean, the first prong is pretty clear. Laws have to have a secular purpose. And so paying the salary of a minister or priest, that's clearly unconstitutional. Paying for repairs on a church building, clearly unconstitutional. The third one, excessive entanglement, a little hard, but again, this has some basis. But what do you mean the primary effect neither advances nor inhibits religion? I mean, primary, does it mean the first effect, primus, or does it mean the overall effect? It needs clarifying. And so both O'Connor and Kennedy sought in their opinions, frequently concurring opinions, to try to clarify what that second prong meant. For O'Connor does a piece of legislation send a message that a certain group, religious group, is preferred and another group is kind of not preferred? Does it endorse a certain religious group, or does it endorse religion? Government putting its finger on the scales for religion. That's a violation, O'Connor says, of the First Amendment. That's not neutral. That's O'Connor's contribution. Kennedy's contribution is whether or not it coerces. A case involving prayer in a public school, a prayer by a rabbi at a baccalaureate service. Kids didn't have to go, but Kennedy said, hey, they want to go to their graduation. And the fact that they don't have to bow their heads or stand or anything, it's coercive. This is a coercive environment, therefore it violates the First Amendment, coercion. So these two standards start appearing and they certainly eat away at Lemon versus Kurtzman. They start weakening. And indeed, under the Rehnquist Court, but more particularly under the Roberts Court, a transformation that results by the appointments that Ronald Reagan made, but more importantly, George W. Bush, George Bush II, and Donald Trump, totally changed the court composition, change it. And what you have is a weakening of that wall between church and state. Well, let's go back to a case before we go to the Establishment Clause cases. Let's go back to that free exercise clause that I briefly mentioned in the last lecture. Employment Division versus Smith. Employment Division versus Smith was an opinion by Justice Antonin Scalia that seemed to dramatically change the scope of the free exercise clause. Employment Division versus Smith was probably the worst case for a free exercise claimant to bring. It came during the era of Ronald Reagan, Nancy Reagan talking about just say no to drugs. And you had Smith and Black, who were drug counselors. But they were also members of a Native American tribe that believed in the use of chewing of peyote. They are dismissed from their jobs as drug counselors, having been found to be chewing peyote. They claimed it's free exercise. This is our religion. This is central. This is like the bread and wine for Catholics and Orthodox. This is central to our religious belief. This was not the case to bring to the Supreme Court, to bring to a court which had been in the process for at least 20 years of watering down the free exercise clause. Yeah, claiming there was a compelling state interest, but finding the compelling state interest for Native Americans was always met. Putting a road through their ancestral burial ground, that was a compelling state interest, not just a burying ground, one that they saw sacred burying ground, that this is something for their religion. Fine, compelling state interest. It had been watered down dramatically. And so Scalia comes to it and totally changes the cases. He says, no, this compelling state interest, that's too much. It means that essentially someone claiming religious beliefs will always win. It's a tough test to, as I mentioned before, if you really believe in compelling state interest, there's very few pieces of legislation passed by government that have a compelling state interest. There's ways around it. And so Scalia comes up and says, look, the only time that you can use the compelling state interest test is when the person who's bringing the claim brings a claim based on free exercise and some other constitutional right. So in Cantwell versus Connecticut, he says there are two issues here: free speech and free exercise. If you put free exercise with free speech together, then government needs to compelling state interest. If you only have free exercise, no. Dramatically changes things. But as I say, it maybe didn't. It leaves Sherbet cuts out sherbet as an exception, unemployment. We needn't get into that area at all. But it doesn't really change matters in terms of free exercise claimants. They were losing anyway. And what happens as a result of employment division, Smith, and really some of the other decisions by the Berger Court, is that Congress reacts. It passes what's called RFRA, or Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It does that 2 years after employment division versus Smith. It basically reinstates the compelling state interest test, requires that. Basically brings us back to Sherbet versus Werner. Now, Congress follows that up with what's called RLUIPA, the Religious Liberty for Institutionalized People Act. Some of the cases involve prisoners, people in other government institutions. Do they have free exercise rights? It passes legislation involving protection of Native American religions, which seem to begin to resurface and to come in conflict with government. Congress reacts to protect religious liberty. So there is this very different change in terms of the court and in terms of where the court is going to be. To go back to the four quadrants, it's going to move the court in terms of free exercise back either into the accommodations or communitarian blocks. At the same time, with the appointments by Republican presidents of judges who tend to be more likely to be in either the communitarian or accommodations block, you get a change in terms of aid to religious schools. State passes a law, Missouri passes a law, which provides for vouchers for people to go to private schools in those districts which schools are underperforming, and provide for the vouchers only to these people who are low income. The court says that's constitutional. That is a dramatic change in terms of the wall of separation. But Lemon survives. Again, I said earlier that you know where the case is going if they start talking about Virginia, Madison, and Jefferson in the first few paragraphs as complementary with respect. The other one is Lemon. When do you use Lemon? As Justice Scalia, a critic of Lemon and of the Supreme Court's handiwork in terms of religion, you can tell if Lemon is mentioned positively where it's going to go. He says Lemon is like that ghoul that has been buried, that is brought out only when the court wants to scare little kids and deny them certain aid. Otherwise, it's dead. So when the Supreme Court wants to uphold a program, such as the voucher program for kids, low-income kids in failing school districts, they don't talk about Lemon at all. They don't say, okay, here's the standard, here's the voucher law, let's use the limit. They don't use it at all. They just ignore it. I mean, the dissenters use it, but the majority just ignores it. But if, in contrast, a 5-member majority is willing to strike something down, then you bring Lemon out. But what begins to happen under the Rehnquist Court, but particularly under the Roberts Court, is that certain of the decisions start getting overturned. The provision, for example, the requirement that public school authorities, public school employees who go to a religious school to give instruction to people with learning disabilities have to stay out in the trailer. That's gone. That's overturned. And several other cases are overturned. The Supreme Court takes a dramatic change in terms of the Establishment Clause and as well in terms of the Free Exercise Clause. The Free Exercise Clause begins, as one colleague says, as basically a super right. There is a phrase that people use in terms of the First Amendment of preferred freedoms, that when you look at the Bill of Rights, certain of the guarantees of the Bill of Rights are more important than others, that some are essential to democracy. That's a concept put forth by Benjamin Cardozo and followed by many other justices since, that there is a hierarchy, if you will, of individual rights. So, for example, in terms of freedom of speech and freedom of press, if you follow some of the British crime shows, if someone's on trial, the newspapers can't talk about it. I mean, the British press is pretty wild, but they're shut up. In the United States, they aren't. Does it interfere with a fair trial? It might. I mean, how are you going to keep the jury totally immune from that? But we say, no, First Amendment is too precious. It's a preferred freedom. If there is a balancing, it wins. What happened, and the same thing with freedom of press and freedom of service, they're essential to democracy. You have to have that. You can have a democracy without jury trial. That's okay. You can pull that off, and certainly you can have one without a 12-person jury. But can you have it without speech, press, association, and present court would say religion, free exercise? Isn't that one of the essential liberties? That's what you get developing in the Roberts Court, a very different position in terms of the importance of the free exercise clause. As I said long ago, traditionally the court was far more concerned with the Establishment Clause than the free exercise clause. Now it seems to be the reverse. The free exercise clause is the more important of the two. That non-establishment is important, but it's a means toward an end. It isn't the end. The end is religious liberty. That clearly is the position of the Roberts Court. And so if you discriminate, if you're not neutral, that's a red flag for the court. Okay, back to employment division versus Smith. Some would see that gutted the free exercise clause, that it took it away, that you needed this two-pronged effect. But in that opinion, Scalia talks about neutrality too, that you can't discriminate. And so a subsequent case, a rather weird case, comes from Florida. The Church of Babalui I versus the city of Hialeah. Castro said, you want Cuban refugees? Well, we'll bring you a group of people. We'll open up the prisons and the asylums. We'll send a very different group of people to Florida than before. And some of them are members of a so-called Santerian religion. The Santerian religion is basically a mix of certain African tribal religions with Catholicism. And it involves animal sacrifices. Well, the Santerians arrive in the city of Hialeah. People don't like them. They're poor. They don't look like the majority. So they're obviously targets for discrimination. And people hear about these religious practices. Well, where did my cat go? Where did my dog go? We have to have a law against this. The American tradition. Solve it. There ought to be a law. And so, city of Hialeah passes a law. But they have to be careful, because in the city of Hialeah, there's a fairly large Jewish population with kosher butchery, which some people disagree with in terms of how the animal is killed. So we have to carve that out as an exception. So it's only the ritual slaughter of animals, not for consumption. So if it's a ritual slaughter of animals for consumption, that's okay. That's kosher. But if it isn't, that's not. But clearly the law was designed aimed at one religious practice. It isn't like saying there can be no serving of alcohol, period. No exceptions. But you have exceptions here. The court says that's a violation of free exercise. It's this aspect of employment division versus Smith that the Roberts Court is going to take hold of in terms of pieces of legislation that make exceptions based on religion. I haven't mentioned earlier of the issue of the so-called Blaine amendments. The Blaine amendments very specifically prohibited aid to religious institutions. The federal Blaine amendment doesn't get anywhere, but the states do. And so many states have laws saying you can't do this. Maine was one of them. Maine had a program in Maine that if you lived in a district where there was not a public high school, you would get compensation to send your child to another public school, high school, in another district or private school. But then they cut out in private schools any that were religiously affiliated. The case of Macon versus Carson, the court says you can't do that. If you're going to provide for this exception, you can't cut religious schools out. In the case of Kennedy versus Bramerton School District, the coach wanted to say a prayer. They say you can't do that. The public school coach can't do that. But they didn't say what else he couldn't do. It was just an exception. He couldn't say prayers. The courts used that case to say that Lemon versus Kurtzman is no longer good law. Essentially, what the court is saying now here is that laws must be neutral. You cannot use religion to either give an advantage or provide a disadvantage. It's a standard that one of the prominent constitutional scholars, Philip Kurland, used back in the 1960s. Pretty much seems to be where the court's going. So far, the court hasn't enunciated a clear standard, but Lemon is gone. Compelling state interest because of RFRA and many state RFRAs is back. It's a very different ball game. The wall is down. Now we're wondering about what is the new standard? When will they be able to enunciate that new standard? Stay tuned. They'll probably be able to do it with the present majority in the next 2 or 3 years. You'll see something.